Is your microphone on, everyone?
Yes. Have a quorum.
You know I'm not happy if I don't boss a little bit.
Is everyone ready? Okay, is everyone ready?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. It's 7:05, Thursday, May 26, 2016. We're calling to order the meeting of the Rent Stabilization Commission for the City of West Hollywood. I would like to invite you to stand while Commissioner Kirkbees leads us in the flag salute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Madam Secretary, may we have a roll call?
Commissioner Bergstein?
Here.
Commissioner Kirkbees?
Present.
Commissioner Gerfinkel? Commissioner Gregoire?
Here.
Commissioner Harker?
Here.
Vice Chair Maggio?
Present.
Chair Saines?
Here. Our first item is approval of tonight's agenda. Do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
I'll make a motion to approve tonight's agenda of May 26, 2016.
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. All in favor of approval, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Is there any opposition? No. The motion passes. The agenda is approved. Now we're coming to the approval of the minutes for April 14, 2016.
I move approval.
I'll second the motion.
Any discussion? No problems with it? Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposition? There being no opposition, the minutes are approved. Now for the approval of the minutes of May 12, 2016.
Was everyone present at that?
Looks like it.
Was there a motion? I'll make a motion to approve May 12th. Is that what we're considering, the minutes?
Yes, May 12,
right.
2016.
Was everyone present at that?
Yes,
They
everyone
were.
was present.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposition? None. Those minutes are approved. We now come to public comment. Are there any speaker slips? No speaker slips. Very good. Then do we have a director manager's report?
Thank you. Good evening. My report will be brief. Looking ahead on June 9th, we do have 2 appeals scheduled. We also have an informational session on expanding smoke-free apartment living across Los Angeles. On June 23rd, we will be announcing the 2016-17 annual general adjustment and the adjustment to the relocation fees. We do not have any appeals scheduled that evening. However, we do need to announce those 2 prior to July 1st. July 14th, we also do not have any appeals scheduled. That is the meeting where we typically reorganize the chair and the vice chair. However, if we do not have appeals, we will go ahead and cancel that meeting and move the reorganization to July 28th. This concludes my report.
I know I sound like a broken record, but again, I'd like to object to canceling a meeting when there are no appeals. We still have a rather ambitious agenda this commission has set forth for the year. I think we could probably find a couple of topics that would fill in the evening's meeting rather than canceling it.
Can we wait a minute?
And,
I need to get some hearing devices.
okay, we're going to wait a moment. Commissioner Maggio is taking care of some business.
I know that we haven't agendized this item for discussion, but I've actually encouraged that we cancel meetings when we don't have a full agenda in order to save city resources and give our staff the evening off because they work a full day before they come here. So unless we can fill our evening with 2 hours worth of work, I'm totally in favor of canceling meetings where we have no agenda item. but perhaps that's something we should agendize for a discussion on another day.
It's time for commission comments. I think we've heard 2 comments. Do we have any more on any subject, commission comments? Okay. Doesn't appear that we do, so this brings us to the appeal of the evening, D4074. And that involves (8255) Norton Avenue, unit number 3. By a showing of hands, would you let me know if there is someone here on behalf of the tenant? Okay. And is there someone here on behalf of the landlord? Yes, all right, so the parties are here. The way that these proceed is that the party who has filed the appeal, who's called the appellant, is going to speak first. Both parties are going to have 5 minutes to talk about their appeal. They're asked to please refrain from trying to introduce new evidence, talk about anything that occurred subsequent to the hearing, and stay on topic with respect to what exactly is the subject of the appeal. The appellant will be able to split his or her time between initial argument and rebuttal, so it could be like 4 minutes, 1 minute, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, however they choose. However, the respondent will have to use their 5 minutes at one time. We begin by having our staff counsel read a report that she has written that discusses the pertinent facts and law relating to this matter and contains a recommendation for the commission. So, counsel?
Thank you. Tenant Spencer Seymour submitted a request for a maximum allowable rent or MAR determination, as well as a determination whether the landlord had accepted any amounts over the MAR. The only issue on appeal this evening is whether the landlord re-registered the unit as required by the rent stabilization ordinance. There is a re-registration form in the record signed by both the tenant and landlord's representative, which is dated June 23, 2009, but there's a conflict in the testimony and evidence concerning when this form was filed. The property manager, Marco Colantonio, testified that he submitted the re-registration form for this unit to the city within a week after it was signed. But the city's records seem to indicate that the form was not filed until January 20th, 2015. The hearing examiner resolved this dispute in favor of the landlord, and staff recommends that the commission uphold this decision. The hearing examiner's findings and conclusions are reasonably supported by the record evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. So, for staff? All right.
And I'm not sure if it's going to be for Ms. Regan or for staff. I'm a little confused. Has the procedure for filing a rent registration changed since 2009? There seems to be that they were not stamped, according to the record, saying they were not stamped back in 2009, that they are now currently stamped. So has that procedure been modified over the years as how those forms are accepted by the city?
Commissioner Bergstein, I'm going to have to interrupt you.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that would be considered new evidence. So the commission is restricted to what was before the hearing examiner. So we can't introduce any other evidence or about procedures that may or may not be occurring at this point in time.
I will say that in the testimony by the manager, he testified that in 2009, when he would deliver the re-registration forms, he would leave them with the receptionist at City Hall, and that there would be no date stamp placed. He testified that within the past year that there's new management and that they're now date stamping it. So that was in the record. But beyond that, we can't go.
And then second minor question, in the, starting on page 63, we have a number of re-registration forms for a property on Palm Avenue. I'm not sure why these were part of this appeal. Was that just the property owner showing that they had a history of filing these forms?
It's the same property owner, and that's my understanding based on the record is that this evidence was submitted to show consistency in how the forms were kept.
Okay,
That the
thank
forms
you.
were not, those forms were not stamped, even though they were shown registered at that time. Okay. Did anyone else have questions? No? Then I would like to hear from Spencer Seymour or his representative, as he is the appellant tonight. When you come to the podium, would you please state your name and your city of residence?
Hi, my name is Spencer Seymour. I'm a resident of the city of West Hollywood.
Thank
The
you.
great city of West Hollywood.
Thank you. How would you like to allocate your time?
I would just like to read a brief statement for 2 minutes, and then I'll take the 3 minutes for after Ms. David.
Very good.
Again, thank you for your time. The evidence involved in D4074 should be black and white. The hearing examiner fails to mention the procedural background that I testified that the reason I requested my rent re-registration is because Ms. David has numerous rent re-registration issues in my building, which is on page 4 of the decision of the hearing examiner. It is a fact that I moved in July of 2009. It is a fact that my rent re-registration was stamped on January 20th, 2015, which is during the time that Ms. David's discrepancies in my building were coming to light. Mr. Colantonio's testimony that it was his practice to drop documents off and maintain the yellow copy may be true, but alas, the apartment was not registered with the city until 6 years later, during which I did receive rent increases. To suggest that a landlord may simply say he or she dropped a rent registration off without any proof or incoming log or documents past or present and begin raising rents sets a dangerous precedent for this entire process of rent stabilization in the city of West Hollywood. There's absolutely no proof that Mr. Colantonio did indeed drop the rent registration off, and to use other non-documented re-registration forms to collaborate his testimony is somewhat incredible to me as a citizen. I have a date-stamped re-registration form, the only one on file, the current one on file in the city. Ms. David and the hearing examiner have Mr. Colantonio's statements and 6 years of, well, where has it been? But more importantly, why did it appear after Ms. David's current rent re-registration issues have arisen? Thank you.
You're welcome. We'd like to now, let's see, I assume there were no questions. Okay. Let's hear from the landlord, either Carolyn David or whomever is her representative.
Hello,
Hi. And you are?
my name's Carolyn David, and I am the owner, one of the owners of...
Do you want to pull the microphone a little closer to your face, please?
Is that
Your
better?
city of residence.
Thank you.
One of the owners of this property.
And your city of residence is?
My city of residence is Irvine, California.
Thank you.
Let me start by saying that the facts of this rent registration or re-registration are that Mr. Seymour moved in July of 2009. He signed the re-registration form in 2009, and he does agree that he did that. Marco says, which he did frequently, he dropped the form off, and there it was. I have had, as Mr. Seymour knows well, an ongoing problem with this particular property. There are 4 different addresses that come under this one property. 1215 North Harper is what they all go under, but 3 of the addresses are on West Norton. West Norton is where Mr. Seymour lives and where I've had repeated problems with the city. What happens to the forms when they get to the city, I don't know. But I did show, and that's why you have it in evidence, that on a simpler property where everything is 1000 North Palm, numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they all go through no problem. But this one property with 4 different addresses that wrap around a corner has been an ongoing headache for me and for the city. In January of 2015, when I think this was discovered. Mr. Noonan may have been relatively new. I don't remember. But I went in and I said, we've got to do something. So at that time, forms appeared that had been, I don't know where. And he did his best to help me. And what the hearing examiner did was go to the incoming log, and she could not find a document that showed that Mr. Seymour's form was logged in January of 2015.
I have to stop you here, though, because she did that after the hearing, and therefore we can't consider what her
It's been
discovery.
here.
I know, but we can't consider it because it was something that was done by the hearing examiner after the hearing, so that the parties didn't have an opportunity to respond to it. You know,
I thought she left the room and then came back in. Actually, is what I thought happened. Do you remember that? She left the room and then came back in?
The record doesn't reflect that the parties had any opportunity
Okay.
to deal with that issue.
That's fine.
So I just wanted to
Okay.
bring that to your attention.
You know what, I stopped by and picked this up so I would be
Right.
aware of what was going on. So for me, it's been an ongoing problem. I have the problem with property tax, with building insurance, and obviously with the city of West Hollywood. If you don't know that 82, 53, 55, and 57 fall under 1215 North Harper, it just sits. So I'll reserve the rest of my time to respond to Mr. Seymour.
All your time is right now. You don't get to split it. So all your time is right now. You have 5 minutes.
Oh.
He gets to,
Oh, okay. Well,
That's-
then what I will say is that I think Mr. Seymour is exaggerating a little bit because he moved in 2009, and the first increase was in 2013. There were 4 years before there was a single increase. He moved in, he paid $10.50 per month. He's now, I believe, at about $10.65. I'm not trying to do something underhanded here, and I've done my best to turn my forms in, as Mr. Noonan knows. I don't know where I am on time, but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I try to be transparent.
it doesn't appear that anyone has questions, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
And does the tenant have a rebuttal argument?
I do, thank you. For Ms. David to assume that I'm exaggerating my claim is incredible to me. The current market value of my apartment is not what is at issue in this. What is at issue is whether or not my rent was raised when my apartment was not registered. It was not. The hearing examiner and Ms. David have no proof that it was until January of 2015. The fact that my rent was not raised prior to the 4 years after I moved in was due to the fact that it was managed by Mr. Ben Wachtel, not Ms. David and Mr. Colantonio at that time, and he personally did not raise anyone's rent in my building. It was his policy and how he operated. So I should be thankful that I'm currently only paying a certain dollar amount is irrelevant to this, and Ms. David knows better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions?
I think Mr. Wattell is Ms. David's father, if that's not correct.
Okay. All right, then at this point, we are closing the testimonial portion of the hearing, and the commissioners will now talk among themselves, deliberate, and come to a decision. Is there anyone who'd like to start the discussion?
All
You
right.
know,
Did someone call out?
that was me.
Yes, please. Commissioner Gregoire.
I was going to say, I was just going to look back on the staff report that says, when an issue on appeal involves a factual dispute, the question is limited to whether there is any evidence of substance that supports the hearing examiner's finding. If such evidence is found, then the decision must be upheld, even if contradicted by other evidence. It's of no consequence that the hearing examiner might have reached a contrary conclusion based on other evidence in the record. The commission does not reweigh the evidence on appeal. So, this is an interesting case for me because I actually think the decision can come out either way. I think the hearing examiner could have come to the contrary conclusion that she did. But there is substantial evidence in the record to support her finding. Therefore, I think, our hands are really tied here. I think it would not be proper for us to reweigh the evidence on appeal here, and if we're doing our job, we should defer to the factual finding of the hearing examiner. And that factual finding was factual finding number 6 on page 25 that says, the landlord submitted this unit re-registration form to the city for filing in 2009. And again, maybe a different hearing examiner would have come to a different decision, but this hearing examiner made that finding a fact. Therefore, I believe that we should uphold this hearing examiner's decision in this appeal.
Commissioner Maggio.
I would like to add that the hearing examiner looked at all the evidence and concluded that the preponderance of evidence supported Mr. Colantonio's testimony that filed the re-registration form for Mr. Seymour tenancy within a week of its signing on June 23rd, 2009. So as a result of this finding, the filing satisfies the rent stabilization ordinance and requirement to re-registrate the unit. Therefore, the rent increase imposed was not unlawful.
Okay. Who else would like to engage in discussion on this? Commissioner Kirby's.
In this case, I think I agree with my fellow commissioners that we have to look at what the hearing examiner did, and that the hearing examiner looked at the evidence. I think that the evidence is weak, and I may not have come to the same conclusion, but that's not for me to say.
I support the copies of
What the hearing examiner did do, though, is weigh the evidence that was in front of her, and she determined that there was substantial evidence to support her decision that the form had been filed and that there was no overpayment of rent. And I think that, so in that case, that kind of resolves it for me. And I don't see the circumstances of this case deteriorating the integrity of the rent stabilization ordinance in any way, and so I have no reason to, look further in. And somebody could make the argument, well, it was just simply a verbal statement, but we use verbal statements all the time, and we can say whether they're good or not. But in this case, I have no compelling reason to go down that road because I don't see any, degradation to or deterioration of the purpose of the rent stabilization ordinance. So I will likely support affirming the hearing examiner's decision.
Is there anyone else who wanted to address this?
If I just may add,
Certainly.
in my experience here and just with working with city staff, they've tend to do an extensive amount of due diligence prior to making a decision, and I weigh their opinion very highly. And in support of the hearing examiner's opinion in this case, and as my fellow commissioners have already noted, on page 22, at the bottom of the page, it clearly states that the original yellow form was presented at the hearing as in supporting a reasonable inference that the landlord filed the white form in 2009. Given that the landlord was able to produce a yellow copy of the form, I would believe that the evidence was presented in the way that it's noted here, and I too would most likely be in support of reaffirming the hearing examiner's decision.
Thank you. Commissioner Harker, did you wish to weigh in?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I too concur with my fellow commissioners. When I first looked at this and noticed the date stamp of January 15, that was a bit curious, as both Mr. Seymour and Mr. Colantonio had signed the re-registration form on 6/23/09. The fact that it was not stamped when he dropped it off at the city does not mean that he held it until January 15th and then took it in. That was simply when the city had stamped it after this started, I'm sure. So I would certainly accept the veracity of Mr. Colantonio's statement that he had, in fact, dropped it off and that the unit was re-registered in June of '09. And there's really no evidence to support anything other than the hearing examiner's findings. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you wish to say a few words?
Just a few that I agree with my fellow commissioners that the decision could have gone either way, but looking at the re-registration form, there's nothing on that form that appears to me that, it was prepared in 2015 and a forged date was added. I think that probably what happened is that the document was timely, dropped off at City Hall, and for some reason didn't get into the records that day, and it just happened, a paper snafu, so to speak. So I would be inclined to affirm the hearing examiner's decision in this matter.
Well, I'm in agreement with my colleagues, and I wanted to speak a little bit about substantial evidence, because Mr. Seymour was saying that there was no evidence presented on behalf of the landlord, and I would say that that is very incorrect. Testimony under oath is, in fact, evidence, and the testimony was found, the testimony of Mr. Colantino was found to be credible. Now, the trier of fact is the person who's sitting there deciding the case, the judge, or if we were in a court, a jury. The trier of fact makes that determination because they're sitting there listening to the person, looking at them, seeing if they appear to be truthful. So that is also a factor. Now, the content of his testimony, I thought, was very persuasive, too. He testified that he managed the property in 2009, and he was responsible for getting the re-registration forms signed and submitted to the city, that it was his practice to have a tenant sign the lease and re-registration form at the same time, and we had actual evidence that supported that substantiated that testimony, because this re-registration form for Mr. Seymour and his lease were signed the same day. Mr. Seymour admitted that he had signed it, so there's no dispute at all that it was signed on that date in 2009. Mr. Colantino testified that he dropped off the re-registration forms with the city within a week of their being signed, that was his custom and practice, and that that when he dropped off the white copy, he dropped off the white copy of the form with the receptionist at City Hall. In 2009, they did not stamp them. That testimony that they were not stamped was also corroborated by the admission of other re-registration forms that were signed at approximately the same time, taken to City Hall in the same manner, were not stamped, and yet were shown registered at that time. So that substantiates his custom and practice testimony. Then he testified that he did drop off the re-registration form from Mr. Seymour approximately a week after it was signed, and that his practice in dropping off the white form and keeping the yellow form, when he would put the yellow form into the tenant's file, and that way he would know when he saw that yellow form that he had dropped off the white form. He submitted that yellow form at the hearing, meaning that it was in Mr. Seymour's file. So all of this, plus the credibility of his testimony, I think came to quite a substantial amount of evidence. Yes, nobody, no one other than Mr. Colantino testified, and there was no documentary evidence that actually showed the date that it was delivered. There was no photograph of it, but a lot of times cases are decided on a lot less evidence. On the other hand, the date stamp on the re-registration form there was no testimony given regarding that. There was no testimony given that it was delivered in 2015 rather than 2009. So I think that when you look at the absence of testimony on the part of the tenant's position and the extensive amount of evidence in favor of the landlord, that we have nowhere to go but to affirm the hearing examiner's findings.
I'm ready to make a motion.
Are you ready to make a motion?
Indeed, I am. I will make a motion to adopt Resolution RSC 16-483, which is a resolution of the Rent Stabilization Commission of the City of West Hollywood affirming the hearing examiner's decision in D-4074, 8255 Norton Avenue, Apartment 3.
Second.
All right, we have a motion as second.
Excuse me.
And was there?
No, it's
Okay,
it's not
fine.
relevant.
Could we please have a roll call vote?
Commissioner Bergstein?
Aye.
Commissioner Kirkes?
Aye.
Commissioner Garfinkel?
Aye.
Commissioner Gregoire?
Aye.
Commissioner Harker?
Aye.
Vice Chair Maggio?
Aye.
Chair Sains?
Aye. The motion carries. If the parties have questions, they'll have an opportunity later on to have those questions addressed by staff. They're always available to talk to you. Now we are moving to new business. Oh, we have, okay, we're not, let's see, presentation, speaker, commission. May I ask, is this comment, it says presentation first, is this comment related to the new business? Oh, all right, so then, and so, okay, so this is going to be heard after the new business. All right, very good. So the new business is going to be incentives for multifamily historic buildings. And I believe that Stephanie, I'm sorry.
Chair,
Yes.
I'd like to introduce Stephanie Reich, the
Thank you.
city's urban designer, who's here and will give a presentation. She has consultants with her who will also be a part of that presentation.
Good evening, commissioners, members of the public. Thank you all very much for hearing about this project that we're very proud to present to you. We're proposing incentives for multifamily historic buildings. I first want to recognize that we had a very extensive public engagement process, and we had a technical advisory group composed of commissioners from your commission. David Gregoire helped us along with the technical advisory group, as well as members of the Planning Commission and the Historic Preservation Commission. And I want to extend my thanks to Commissioner Gregoire for his patience and diligence in joining us at all those meetings, half a dozen meetings at least. So I would like to ask you for review and comment of tonight's presentation. And I'd like to introduce at this time our fabulous consultant team, John Lisak and Flora Chu from Page & Turnbull. They will do a relatively brief presentation and then turn it back to me. Thank you.
Good evening, commissioners. Thanks for having us. We're pleased to be here to present the results of our study to date. I'm John Lisak. I'm a historic architect and principal with the firm Page & Turnbull. With me today is Flora Chu. She's a preservation planner. And I wanted to acknowledge Donovan Ripkema, who is a world-renowned economist who focuses on historic real estate and incentives for reuse of that real estate throughout the world. And Don couldn't be with us tonight, but he'll be at future presentations. Have the next slide, please. So tonight, our presentation is organized to give you the project objectives and cover our methodology, review the included buildings, present the key findings, look at the potential incentives, and we considered a whole slew of incentives, so we looked at approximately 20. Many of them we decided not to pursue. And then we'd like to get feedback from you, particularly on two items. One is the rent registration fee waiver, and the other is an alternative to cyclic painting requirements that are in the rent stabilization ordinance. Can I have the next slide, please? So financial incentives that are targeted specifically for historic buildings are relatively rare. There aren't that many. Historic preservation incentives that also encompass rent-stabilized buildings are almost non-existent. So this, in some ways, this study is unique and groundbreaking. At the beginning, we worked with staff and we heard from stakeholders, and we set up a number of objectives and principles that we wanted to address throughout the course of our study. First is that we wanted to develop incentives that address the dual priorities of historic preservation and rent stabilization. So it's not an either or. We're not trying to weigh one or the other. We want to preserve the building and we want to preserve it as a rent stabilized property. Secondly is that we want to encourage private investment for the upkeep and upgrade of the buildings. We really want to have the owners invest private money. And last is that we want to close the gap between initial capital cost required for major repairs and kind of the long-term value of the property. As part of that, we wanted to develop a range of incentives. As we'll show as we go throughout the slides, there's a wide variety of variables throughout these properties in our study, and you need more than one tool to provide assistance. Part of our mission was to determine if historic properties are more costly to maintain and repair than older buildings. We wanted to identify conflicts between the historic preservation ordinances and the rent stabilization ordinances and offer some solutions. And last, we wanted to treat the building as a client. Owners come and go, tenants come and go, but the objective of kind of a designated historic property is for it to be around for multiple generations. So we really wanted to treat the building as a client. Next slide. So it's been a long process and a very interesting one. Our methodology was first to gather all the information possible on the property. So things ranging from parcel size, zoning, building history, building permits, ownership information, historic information, and even duration of tenancy. Once we collected that, we wanted to look at the existing conditions, so we did visit all the buildings and took a look at the outside. From there, we selected about a third of them, and we went and did a conditions assessment inspection. And from there, we actually whittled that number down and went and looked at specific properties to look at specific things with an engineering team and cost estimators. We did a significant amount of community outreach. First was to hear from different groups what their concerns were, and then we worked to vet the process both with kind of an expert advisory group and different kind of focus groups, and we'll go over that in more detail in a little bit. And last, we wanted to identify and evaluate incentives that address the building needs, meet the project goals, reflected stakeholder interest. It was interesting, some things that came up didn't register and other things did. And then we wanted to weigh the cost and benefit to the city. And also, we got input from the city attorney as far as what we could move forward. Next slide. So it's a relatively small pool of buildings, but it's about, in relation to rent stabilization, which is about half of the designated historic buildings in the city. West Hollywood's unique in that it has so many historic apartment buildings. It's pretty rare that the majority of the buildings in the city are apartments. So we looked at 39 buildings with about 600 units total. That's about 3% of the city's rental housing units and about a little bit less than 5% of the rent-stabilized units. Buildings range in size. The smallest one was 3 units, 1 story. The biggest was a 60-unit building, and the tallest was 7 stories. And most of the buildings have less than 20 units, so they're relatively small scale. Next slide, please. So our key findings, the first one is that the buildings are generally well maintained. They're not neglected. People care for them. It was pretty obvious. However, the kind of major systems, so the structural system, the electrical system, heating, ventilation, and kind of life safety, sprinklers, alarms, are old, in many cases original and over 80 years old, and they're in need of renewal and replacement. It's time. These are the systems that are most likely, their problems with them are most likely to result in catastrophic loss. So if the structural system isn't upgraded, it could have problems in an earthquake. If the electrical system isn't upgraded, there's a higher risk for fire, those sorts of things. And again, there's nothing out there that made us go, oh my God, this is a major crisis. It's just things are kind of at the end of their service lives. So the next one was that we did quite a bit of financial analysis to look at kind of repair and rehabilitation costs. So when I say repair, I mean kind of every 20-year type of cyclic cost, and then for rehabilitation, looking at kind of every 40, 50, 60-year costs. So they're kind of longer term, not so much immediate. And we found that in order to do them in an appropriate fashion for a historic building, there is a cost increase. And we found that that was about 20 to 40% more than a typical older building. We also found, the flip side of that, is that rent stabilization was less than a problem than originally thought when we got into the study. The majority, about 2/3 of the properties, have tenants that have been in place for 10 years or less, so they're paying at or close to market rate. The long-term tenants were around 20% or so. Also looking at kind of previous data collected by Housing Department, the historic buildings rent at a premium. They rent for 25 to 50% more than a kind of a comparable unit that's in an older building, but not necessarily a historic building. So the quality of space and architecture does have a monetary value associated with it. Next slide. So we collected all this data and did quite a bit, and one of the things we found was the properties vary wildly. Physically, they vary wildly, and we developed these kind of 6 categories to group them in just to make our job a little bit easier. And they range from tall buildings to these kind of house-like buildings. And a tall building has kind of a different set of issues. So it has an elevator, it has a fire escape, it has a sprinkler system, it has an alarm system, whereas kind of the smaller buildings don't necessarily need to worry about any of those things. And there's also kind of a variation in age of construction, and that led to kind of different physical deterioration and condition issues. So the post-war buildings, the buildings built after World War II, have a lot more wood siding on the outside. They have kind of different paint needs. They both had swimming pools, so they have all the kind of maintenance associated with swimming pools. So we found that, one, the physical characteristics are very different, but also the conditions of specific things are very different. So you can't just say all of them need a paint job. That's not the case. Next slide, please. We also found a large variety in ownership profile. There's a number of kind of sophisticated property management teams that own and operate some of the buildings, and others are operated and owned by family trusts or individuals. We found that there's a difference in the kind of duration of time and attitudes related to buildings. So about 1/3 of the ownership groups have had the building for more than 20 years. About 1/3 is under 10 years. I think one sold within the past year. And then there's kind of some in the middle between 10 and 20 years. And that it has a big effect on kind of the property tax. And there's one of the incentives that is in place in town, and it's a pretty well-used one, is called the Mills Act. And the Mills Act is a property tax abatement. And if you're not familiar with it, I can go into more detail during questions. But effectively, it represents savings to newer owners, but not so much a change in the property tax for older long-term owners. And we also found that there's kind of an attitude difference of the owners from different generations. The older, longer duration owners tended to find rent stabilization to be more a burden, whereas the newer owners found it to be a constraint, but they bought the property or purchased the property understanding it was rent stabilized and felt comfortable with that. Next slide, please. So as part of our work, we did considerable community engagement. As Stephanie mentioned, we had a technical advisory group, and I wanted to thank David for participating in the meetings and providing valuable input as we went along. I also wanted to thank housing staff for attending all those meetings. We also did 10 kind of public meetings. Excuse me. Most of them were geared towards different kind of focus groups. So we met specifically with tenants, we met specifically with property owners, we met specifically with real estate professionals. First we got kind of their concerns, and they were different, and then we got feedback on the incentives that we proposed and changed some of our priorities based on that. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Flora, and she's going to review the incentives themselves.
Good evening. So we started to look at a wide range of incentives, thank you. And we're initially developing the incentives based on the premise that there is an incremental cost to owning these properties based on the combination of two factors. That with rent stabilization, there's foregone rents between the stabilized and market rate rents, which is offset somewhat by the overall higher rents that the historic properties will command. But there's also an incrementally higher cost for the repair and rehabilitation of the historic properties. And so we evaluated the incentives based on their effectiveness to bridge that gap between rents available and the cost of improvements. And we also received feedback from our stakeholders to tell us what kind of incentives they would be more willing to use and which ones they didn't think would be as effective. And working with city staff, we worked to balance assisting owners with ensuring that the incentives would be used for the buildings, that the buildings would be the ones to benefit from these incentives. So we have 4 incentives that we are going to cover and are asking for some feedback on, a couple of these specific to rent stabilization. Next slide, please. So these are the 4 that will be going forward, or that we are as part of the staff's report. And we'll go through each one and give you a little bit of background on each. Next slide, please. So the first is technical assistance. One of the things we did hear quite a bit from owners was the need to help with some of the more complex problems that come up as they were dealing with larger repairs and rehabilitation issues. And so one of the things that we felt that the city could help is to provide technical assistance, a one-stop shop, someone that the owners can turn to help resolve some of the issues with when they're dealing with rehabilitation issues that may come up. Mostly help to navigate between city agencies, someone who understands the buildings both from historic preservation side and rent stabilization side. And that would be navigating city agencies as well as agencies outside of the city. Often we were hearing that owners were having issues with Southern California Edison or with fire department as they were trying to do electrical upgrades and understanding the constraints that may come with historic preservation or rent stabilization. We would also want to see that the person provide some assistance with making sure that the owners had access to qualified craftsmen and contractors, those who are familiar with historic buildings, and to assist with accessing existing available incentive programs, both the Mills Act program and the 20% historic rehabilitation tax credit. That is one of the most effective programs out there that's offered at the federal level, and is one of the programs that helps to really bridge that gap and help with major rehabilitation. Next slide, please. So to qualify for the 20% federal historic rehabilitation tax credit, a building would have to be listed on the National Register. And so far of the buildings that we looked at, the 39, 9 of them are already listed. We think the others most likely would qualify, but they would have to go through that process of being listed. And so a technical assistance person can help both with the National Register process and with the tax credit process. And again, with the Mills Act, we have about 18 of the properties currently have a Mills Act contract, and we believe there's probably at least 10 others that can see some tax savings through a Mills Act contract that the technical assistance could help with getting them involved with the program. Next slide, please. So we were also looking at fee waivers, which for the historic properties under the Historic Preservation Ordinance, their planning fees are waived, but not the building safety permit fees. And so we would want to see that would help to ensure that the properties do go through the permit process and doesn't create a barrier to doing work with permits, and with the idea that the savings could then be reinvested into the property. In a similar vein, we would see a 50% reduction to the rent registration fee that will allow the owners to use that funds to reinvest in the property. And it's an acknowledgement from the city that the owners are making a good faith effort to maintain the building, are continuing to do that into the future. We are also looking at an alternative to the rent stabilization painting standards, which right now requires exterior painting every 7 years and interior painting every 4 years. That's not necessarily the best practice for historic buildings, where you want to paint only when it's necessary, just because additional layers of paint can cause a loss of character to a lot of the features that make the buildings distinctive and could lead to more problems in the future. So we will propose having an alternative painting schedule that can be approved by city staff that makes sense for the building, and then the owners will be held to that painting schedule rather than the one that is currently in the rent stabilization ordinance. Next slide. Then we were also looking at trying to find sort of larger tools that would provide some capital infusion to these properties to help incentivize them to do the major rehabilitation work. And as John mentioned, there's not very many tools that are available, but we looked at the ones that are most common, and one of the ones that often does come up is a transfer of development rights or selling air rights program, which the city of West Hollywood actually does have on its books dating from 1994, but has never been used for various reasons. What it does it would allow the properties that are actually built below what would be allowed by zoning to sell those unused square footage, and that way have some funds then that could be put back into the building. The city's role would be to pre-certify the properties that have the unused development rights, so that everyone would know who they are, and the developers who are looking for additional square footage can know who to go to negotiate those sales, and it would be a private negotiation between the owners and the developers. And we would want to see that most of the proceeds of that sale would go back into the repair and rehabilitation for the historic building. So we would want to see a requirement that there would be a rehabilitation plan similar to the Mills Act program, which requires talking about what the cost would be and a time frame so that the work would be done within a reasonable amount of time. Next slide, please. So currently, of the properties that we were looking at, there's 17 that are built below what would be allowed by zoning, and that accounts for about 89,000 square feet of unused development rights. Interestingly enough, there's almost the same number, 18 of the properties that are actually built above what's allowed by zoning. So they would not have the ability to sell any rights. They're built out to more than they are allowed. For most of the properties that are below allowable zoning, they have a range of how much undeveloped rights they have to sell, which some range from 1 to 3 units, and there's a few that have quite a number to sell. And we can go into more details, but in questions if you have about what this type of program would look like, but I think we would want to make sure that it would be a program that was easier to use, that where the unused rights can go to. That's one of the issues about why the program has not been used, is trying to create a market for the unused development rights. And so that would be one of the modifications to the program, is trying to create that market in a way that makes sense for the city, and that makes it clear for everyone involved on how to use this type of program. Next slide, please. So we want to go through briefly some of the programs that we consider but did not pursue, and just to give you a sense of the wide range of programs that we looked at. Next slide. One of the ones that we spent some time on, but ultimately decided it's not being recommended at this time, is a historic apartment preservation program, which is tied to a purchase of a preservation easement from the property owners. It's a program that we've seen used in a few other cities in a kind of a competitive program that would award funds to the best rehabilitation plan, ones that are proposing to do work that would meet the city's goals. And in exchange, the city would provide some funding to help bridge that gap of what the work that's being proposed and the rents that's available. This type of program, we think we would want to see a contribution from the owner, a financial contribution of an equal match or greater, and that would be part of the competitive process, looking at how much the owner would provide. And as part of that, they would record a historic preservation easement, which would give the city some greater oversight over the property as it is currently under the preservation ordinance. We would also want to see a covenant to not remove the property from rent stabilization for a certain period of time. Next slide, please. So this program, for a long time, we had a good number of reasons for why it should move forward, but there are also a good number of reasons for why it may be difficult to move forward with this. It would provide a fairly modest to significant financial impact in our financial modeling. It can make a significant difference for some properties and more modest ones for other properties. It will allow the city to target those significant the improvements for the critical systems, as John was mentioning, structural upgrades or fire, life safety, or electrical upgrades. It would be available to all property owners, and that is one of the issues with some of the other incentives, is ensuring that it was available to as many as possible. And compared to some of the other incentives we were looking at, it was fairly relatively easy to implement. On the con side, it would require substantial capital investment by the city to provide the funds that would make a difference to incentivize the owners to do this type of work. The city would be getting a minimal additional review authority over what it currently has. The covenant, from our understanding, to remain in rent stabilization would not be binding. And there are other needs that the city has for the properties within the city. We understand there's a seismic study that's ongoing, as well as a multifamily rehabilitation study that could identify other needs that the city may have. Next slide, please. So also quickly looking at the list of all the other incentives we looked at, there were a wide range of large-scale incentives to sort of more modest incentives. Just to share a few of them, we were looking at a 12-month temporary accommodations as an incentive. One of the reasons that a lot of these buildings have not undergone a major rehabilitation is that they've been continuously occupied since they were built 80 to 90 years ago. And it's often difficult to do a major capital improvement project with the tenants in place. So what the city could potentially provide is a way to make the temporary relocation a simpler process, or to provide actually the temporary accommodations so that the work could be done during a relatively narrow period of time. And this was started to become sort of a more complex process of how to determine how to provide comparable accommodations and to meet all the various housing laws. So at this point, we were not moving forward with that. There was also talk of a cost-sharing capital cost program, which I believe the housing department is actually studying for all the rent-stabilized properties in the city. So we didn't think that we needed to repeat that. Next slide. We also heard a lot of great suggestions from our stakeholders about incentives to consider, and we thought that actually a number were really interesting ideas that the city may want to consider for other programs, such as having an awards program or a licensing fee for the city to use the buildings in their marketing material. One that did come up quite often was the conversion to condominiums or other uses for these properties, and that, to us, did not meet our project goals to make sure that the buildings remain in rent stabilization, so we did not move forward with that one as well. Next slide, please. So that sort of wraps up our presentation, and we are asking for your feedback tonight on these incentives. I think particularly the 50% rent registration fee and the alternative to the rent stabilization painting requirements. And we will be here to answer questions if you have any. I'll turn it back over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Flora. Thank you, John.
Yes, yeah. Well, I would go either way.
We wanted to provide you a couple
One
of...
moment, please. Do
Yes,
you prefer
please.
us to ask you the questions or the participants?
You can please ask the questions, and whoever is best equipped to answer will answer. Likely, maybe it will be me, but they're much smarter than I am, so.
And I take it you have a question.
Well, yes, I do. First of all, I congratulate you on all this.
May I mention just a couple of items, please, before you start the questions?
All right, if that's what you would like to do.
Thank you. I'd like to give you a couple of updates. We did provide a presentation to the Historic Preservation Commission. We had a lot of community participation. The preservation community came out for that meeting, and the Historic Preservation Commission included, because the Historic Preservation Commission does make a recommendation to council. We're asking for your commission to provide us feedback, but the HPC provides a formal recommendation to council in which they included the Historic Apartment Preservation Program. Staff is not recommending that program for the variety of reasons that Ms. Chu talked about. It's a substantial investment in a small number of properties with not a substantial benefit to the city and for the other reasons that she stated. I also wanted to mention that we'll be doing a presentation to Planning Commission next week, Thursday, June 2nd, and we expect and hope to go to City Council with the recommendations, including your comments and comments from other commissions on August 15th. And with that, I want to thank you very much and open it for questions.
Thank you. Commissioner Maggio, you had a question.
Yes, I was most curious about that there was even thought that it didn't cost more money to keep up an historic building, considering there are more details, and often the materials that are used today are different materials that were used then. Could you answer why that was sort of vague to me?
I asked that question.
You want to answer?
I wanted to confirm that additional cost, have a clear understanding of the reasons for that additional cost, and a little bit, some data about that additional cost, since that was one of the primary reasons we were undergoing this very thorough study on these particular buildings.
All right, because I can understand electrical and alarms, et cetera. The second question I have all the historic buildings in West Hollywood been identified? Are there any left that you think?
So we have 80 plus designated historic buildings. We have very soon after cityhood in 1987, there was a citywide survey that surveyed all of the properties in the city with the exception of single-family residential properties. And so we have a list of potential historic properties from that original survey. One item of note is that most other cities treat designated historic properties differently than all other properties. In West Hollywood, we look at our survey, and anything that is a potential historic property, we treat as if it is a historic property. That means you need a certificate of appropriateness to do any changes to that property. We are currently undergoing a commercial survey to update the survey for all of the commercial properties. We are also undergoing a survey of bungalows in an area on the east side, and we anticipate to complete our, to fill the gap in our survey, and this is not scheduled, but we expect to do a survey of all the single-family buildings at some point in the near future.
Would that then they be considered a B list until they are identified?
They are considered, each time a project comes before us, we review it for its potential historic nature, and that includes the single-family residential properties.
Can I weigh in a little bit on this?
Please.
So the state environmental quality laws and the national federal environmental quality laws don't care if the building's designated or not. They only care if it's been found eligible by a qualified architectural historian or historic architect, and then that triggers kind of environmental review. So the California Environmental Quality Act, while it's important that the building is designated, that doesn't necessarily matter for triggering California Environmental Quality Act review. It only merely needs to be eligible for listing. So it's kind of different, but it's a much larger pool typically.
And my last question is, who are we depending on to identify many of the buildings? Do you spot it yourself? Are we hoping people bring that information to light?
So the National Park Service maintains a professional qualification standard, and if you meet those standards, then you're eligible to make, to review buildings and judge them eligible or not eligible.
But more specific.
For instance, I have a question that actually is germane to me. For instance, I live in a Robert Byrd building that was designed and built in 1953, but I've never seen anyone really be interested in it, although it's incredibly unusual. And who would I ask to actually look at this, to consider it?
So and I failed to do so today, but I could, myself or any member of the planning staff can look at our list of surveyed properties and see if that property is in fact on our list as potentially historic. We have qualified historic preservation professionals leading our survey teams, and so all of our surveys are done by qualified professionals, but any property that has not been surveyed can also be nominated.
And I think that's...
For instance, there is a fricate that on my street that was identified perhaps 15 to 20 years ago, but it actually took the individuals who lived in that building to actually bring it to the attention of the city.
And the city has been doing things like updating their survey. So one of the things that Stephanie mentioned is the city did a survey many years ago, and over time, buildings do get older, and our understanding of what becomes historic changes. And so I think what we found with the buildings that we looked at in the survey, only 2 of them are from that post-war period. But we expect, as time moves forward, there may be more buildings from that post-war period that we recognize as being historic, that either gets designated specifically on the local register or gets picked up in surveys as those are updated over time. So the properties you're talking about may not have been picked up in the earlier survey. They were not maybe at that point where they were being recognized as historic yet, but if surveys are done in the future, they may get picked up.
My last question. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that you just said you have one more. If you could hold your question for a moment. We were specifically asked if we had any questions or wanted to provide any feedback with respect to two recommendations that were made. One was the rent registration fee waiver, and the other was the modification of the rent stabilization ordinance to allow an alternative plan to replace the 7-year repaint rule. So does anyone want to address that? I see you nodding your head down there. Questions or comments?
I do have one question / comment. In item 2, the 50% rent registration fee.
That was it.
Sorry?
I'm sorry, I was glad you brought that up. That's what I'm saying.
I wanted to ask, at the very end of that section on page 5, the last line reads, "This money could be used." I was wondering, is there any restriction on us to perhaps propose a must be used if we're going to be providing a fee waiver that is intended on being used for rehabilitation and renovation? Is there anything restricting us from actually making it have to do so?
No, there's not, and Mr. Noonan and I have already talked about how that would be implemented as a shall rather than a should.
Do my fellow commissioners have any opinion on that? Perhaps that's something that we can add to our recommendation?
I think it's a good recommendation.
Well, as, I know it's not one of our 4, but it's talking about selling of the air rights. Most of the money has to go for rehabs. I'd kind of like to discuss how do we quantify what most is? So if we're going to quantify that half of the rent registration fee, how that's being spent, how do we quantify the air rights funding also?
Right.
May I answer? For the air rights portion, we will be developing a sort of model contract for those properties, and we anticipate, because that's a little bit more complex to administer, that there would be, say, a 10 or 15% administration fee that would be allowed, but that the money from a sale of air rights would be held in some kind of trust that could then be drawn upon when invoices are provided, and that 10 or 15% administration fee could be added to those invoices. That's the kind of thing that we've been talking about.
May I add something to that? I attended 3 of the 4 focus groups in January, I believe, January, February. When the air rights, in quotes, the modified TDR program was brought up, one of the owners, there were only 3 there out of the 38, but one of them was really not interested in and felt it was unfair that if an owner could sell these air rights, that the money was theirs. I mean, this is an individual who keeps his building up at any rate, and he said that he would not be interested in having the city dictate what he could do with that money, that this was his investment, and if he was going to be allowed to sell it, then he should be allowed to decide what he would do with the money. So I don't think that was a real popular incentive.
Well, one of the requirements of the proposal is very similar to your current in-place incentive, which is the Mills Act. So the property owner, as part of the transaction, would have to provide a maintenance and rehabilitation plan. He would have to say what he proposed to do with the money. He would have to provide cost estimates, and he would have to provide a schedule. So that's a requirement of the incentive, and that would have to be approved either by staff or by commissions. And that's the practice that's currently in place for the Mills Act incentive, so it wouldn't be that hard to transfer into this incentive.
Anyone else? Well, were there any other, are there any other comments or questions regarding the 4 points that we were?
I have an additional, if I may. In terms of the alternative RSO painting requirements, do we have the opportunity to perhaps alternate from painting and maybe, for example, still requiring a type of maintenance, but that doesn't require the coating of paint? So perhaps maybe a pressure wash that upkeeps the exterior of the building or something along those lines. Is that something that we've looked into at all?
Those are alternatives. I think the objective is to not have as prescriptive of a requirement and allow an appropriate requirement to be put forward, but then it has to be approved. So a cleaning requirement could be part of it. I think each individual case would come forward and there'd be some negotiation on what the treatment would be. Mm-hmm. And then once that plan was approved, it would go into effect, and then that would be the schedule. So cleaning could obviously be be a component of that,
Okay.
yes.
And following up on the same matter, then you're talking about dealing with each building on a one-on-one basis
Correct.
regarding that kind of maintenance. Well, what would trigger it? I mean, now, what will trigger it is the 7 years requirement for paint, but what would trigger it in
Well,
the
they have
one-on-one
to come
situation?
forward. It's the 7-year requirement until they propose something else. So the requirements would remain in place until they came forward with a plan, and the plan would have to have a schedule of when they were going to do what they were going to do.
No, but I mean, if you're handling, if it would be dealt with on a one-on-one basis, then I thought you were asking us to revise the rent stabilization ordinance. Maybe I misunderstood. I thought we were being asked, would we revise the rent stabilization ordinance with respect to the requirement for repainting every 7 years, as it and say that that doesn't apply to historic buildings because they will be dealt with on a one-on-one basis.
That's
Did I
not
misunderstand?
exactly right. What we're asking for is that if a property owner would like the alternative painting schedule, they will need to proactively come to the city and get that alternative approved. If there's not an alternative approved, they are subject to that 7-year painting schedule.
So you're asking to put
Chair,
something
I think
into-
you're right, though. I think that it would be advisable for us to, not particularly tonight, but put that in specifically, that, this would be an alternative if you own an historic property.
So,
Yes, and that's what we're proposing, to change the
Right.
language of the ordinance to allow that alternative to
Well,
happen.
then we're on the same page, because that's what I was saying, is that I assumed that we were being asked to change the ordinance, and I was kind of asking, how would it be changed? But okay, I think I've got it now. Does anyone else want to talk about the points that we were
I have one more
asked to comment about?
on the air rights, because I find it fascinating. So would the city sort of maintain a list of air rights that are available for sale, and then if a commercial property would come before the city, say, oh, if you would like to have would the city offer, say, if you'd like to have a denser, or would it be a developer comes, say, I'd like to have a denser development?
Well,
How do I
typically-
do it? How would that work,
Yes,
sort of?
so what we're proposing is that we would approach the owners of these properties and ask them to enter into a contractual agreement so that we would have something in place should a developer come to us and ask for additional density. We would say, this is a good candidate for our transfer of development rights. Here are a list of property owners who hold these rights. You can go and negotiate with them under these terms, but the city stays out of that negotiation. Without that pre-certification, we wouldn't have a credible and reliable pool to make this happen, because developers, when they come in, and it's, just to clarify, it's always the developer that's asking for additional density. The city is never recommending additional density. And so they're asking for additional density, and they have a timeline. So in order to make sure it was predictable, we would have a list of pre-certified owners that they could go and negotiate with.
perhaps before you end your comments, Ms. Reich, maybe could you explain density?
Yes, density, when we're talking about housing projects, density means number of housing projects per square footage of land. It's a little bit of a different calculation with commercial properties, but it essentially means it's equivalent to our FAR, floor area ratio calculation, whereas if a floor area ratio is allowed to be 1.5 FAR, that means that a building can be 1.5 times the square footage of the property.
So, in a situation where the pricing of the developer's new project, let's say, inflates significantly due to the added cost of this purchase, is there any sort of mechanism that will then prevent that additional fee from just simply being pushed onto future renters and eventually significantly increasing our renter cost market?
So what we anticipate is that the developers of commercial properties will be wanting to purchase these air rights. Developers of residential properties do have an incentive in what's commonly called SB 1818, affordable housing incentives. So under our proposal, a developer can choose either or. If a developer is doing a housing proposal and chooses to do an SB 1818 project, they can use that incentive. Or if they don't choose to do affordable housing as part of their project, they would be eligible to use this transfer of development rights. They cannot use both and.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments?
On those two items, you mean, Chair?
Yes, or any of the four before us, if we have no further on that.
I have comments. I'm not sure if it's going to fit within your specific guidelines, but I have about 4 or 5 things.
Well, if we've completed that, then we can move to other things.
Okay, I see, yes. So
You
do you
have
want
one
us to
more.
agree on these 4 items now and then
Well-
have additional questions?
No, we were just to review and comment, that we were only asked to review and comment.
All right.
So
I have no-
if we've completed our comments and questions then on that, then were there other questions that people wanted to
I'll say yes. I'm not sure. Yes to all the above. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very informative and a lot to think about. But kind of back, since we were just on the issue of the air rights, you had just mentioned, Ms. Reich, about how the negotiation would go, or who might be eligible, or which density bonus, or how they might qualify or choose. So, is there do we have or does the city have the ability to, in that, also require that if you're going to purchase these air rights, that they do have to be used for a certain reason, maybe specifically affordable housing or a certain portion?
There was discussion about requiring, because as I mentioned, we do expect these projects that use them to be more commercial or mixed use. There was discussion and there's a desire to ensure that there are neighborhood-serving commercial uses in those buildings. We will certainly take a hard look at that. Use other than either housing or commercial, a specific type of commercial use, in my humble opinion, is a challenging thing to write into code. We would likely not require those to be used for affordable housing because there is that SB 1818 bonus. So we would likely encourage the use of this incentive because it forwards the goal of helping maintain the historic buildings under rent stabilization.
We kind of give and take. We don't necessarily get what we want over here, but it's for the purpose of funding this other goal that we're.
Exactly.
Can so you have an existing transfer of development rights programs now. The problem with it is there's not a market for it. There's other less expensive or easier ways to get your additional density. SB 18 is one of them, but there's a whole slew of them. There's many ways to get additional density. So this program, there's no market for it. There's no demand for it. I can go get my density in a different way. What we're trying to do is create a market, and the kind of reviewing the code, the best market is the kind of these pockets of commercial properties, and in the full report there's a map of kind of areas we've identified, because the commercial properties don't have as many opportunities to get additional density. So this would be something where they really would want to make use of the program.
And this has
Yeah.
worked in other areas?
Well, more specifically, I think what Mr. Lezak is saying, that the Transfer of Development Rights Program that was adopted in 1994-ish was tied to the Sunset Specific Plan and Sunset Boulevard specifically. On Sunset Boulevard, there has been the ability and the desire to get density in other ways, often through development agreements. What we are proposing to create the market that Mr. Lezak is talking about is these particular properties along Santa Monica Boulevard that have no other mechanism other than the SB 1818 to get any allowable additional height or density. So what we are suggesting is that they have the opportunity, as their neighboring properties do that are eligible for a mixed-use density bonus, which allows an addition of 0.5 FAR and 10 feet in height. We are suggesting that these particular properties would have that same advantage if they would buy them from the historic buildings.
Thank you.
If I could interject just a moment. Once the commissioners have finished their questions of staff, we need to allow the public to comment on this item, and then the commission can make their comments before any action is taken.
Thank you.
So that's following questions.
Correct.
Okay.
My next question has to do with the 50% re-registration fee. We're talking about of the $120 per unit, the 60 of it that usually that would primarily be the part that the property owner is required to pay. Sometimes they can pass the other half on to the tenant. Was it looked at why the tenant shouldn't be participating in this as well, since they're benefiting from it, or why the city wouldn't give up the other half? I mean, it seems like a nominal fee to the city. Was that even considered?
Sure, I'll take that question. So we shouldn't look at this as a reduction or a waiver. I know it has that in the name. However, the reality of this, when Ms. Reich and I talked about implementing this, is that the money is going into the building. So foreseeably, if the tenant wants to take the money and put it into the building, certainly we would reduce both. But the fact is, it's a small fee, it's a small amount of money, but that $60 would go into the maintenance of the building, not into the landlord's pocket.
Well, we would be waiving versus 50%. I mean, the tenant has no control over it. They either are required to pay it by the landlord, or they don't have to by the landlord. The landlord's 120 or total. I'm just wondering if we considered that
The fee is not going to change from $120 per unit unless it increases for other reasons. But there's going to be no, per se, waiver where someone pays less. The fee doesn't change. It's how the money is used. How much of the money goes to the city, how much of the money goes back into the building.
So I guess, did we consider 100% versus 50% of the city offering? I mean, that's my question.
Would the city
put 100% in, or would the...
Right. Would the city give up 100%?
Yeah.
You know, we could consider something like that. In fact, we may look at that in the multifamily rehabilitation study, since we're still looking at incentives. The intention there, though, I want to be clear, is that the money doesn't go into the tenant's pocket.
No.
The money goes into the building.
Yeah, no, this would be...
I think the...
But that's separate and apart from this study, and we'll bring that back at a future date.
The intent of maintaining the 50% is that it is important to track the rents, and having someone come in to pay the fee is a very useful way of making sure we get that re-registration every year. So that was part of the reason for the 50%.
So with that actually being said, what do we project as being the future protocol for managing this process? So is that the city going to maintain a coffer for each individual building and then allocate the money? Is the
The one idea is that as property owners come forward to re-register, they would provide invoices for their repair and maintenance, so they can prove that they've put this money into the building.
Okay, thank you.
And I think my last question is some sort of public trust or an account that the city is not the owner of, that have we looked into, or has it been successful in other cities where, let's say, a historical society or a preservation society has a public trust that the city either contributes somehow, or the city, I think similar to how the city participated in setting up the West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation, for example, that the city was very involved and still to this day is involved in that, and sometimes loans money or helps with those situations. Has that been looked into to where it's less of the city's tax dollars, but more of a community effort to preserve the buildings in our neighborhoods?
That was something that was suggested at the HPC meeting, to set up a foundation that would maybe run tours through the property and be a vehicle for collecting money. That's something we didn't seriously look at, partially because the city couldn't really administer. The city could participate in assisting in setting up such a foundation, but there didn't seem to be readily available a vehicle for setting that up and administering it.
Have there been cities, I'm thinking like larger cities, probably New York?
Chicago, I believe, has such a foundation. That's a little bit
struggle
larger
to
of
get
a city.
money to.
A little bit.
Thank you.
Okay. Further questions? Another question?
Mine was along the lines of Commissioner Gerfinkel, and that is, how will this be tracked, and who will be the oversight on whether this money will only be once a year to see if somebody's turning in their receipts, or although I believe I heard a consultant say that most of these buildings seem to be in fairly good shape on the exterior. Is that correct? I mean, that they seem to be keeping theirs up, those that you looked at?
They're not neglected, they're well maintained.
Yeah, because that is a benefit to the owners, certainly, to keep their buildings in good shape, particularly the historic ones. So that would be, I would be interested in who was, how the oversight. I know that there is a property in our fair city that does have the Mills Act, but apparently is still falling apart, so they haven't been using, and I don't know who's tracking that. Are they using the money that they're saving in their taxes to actually rehabilitate their buildings and keep them up? So oversight I'd be interested in that.
If I may, if there's any other questions related to the presentation or to the staff report itself, I'd say we should continue with the questions. However, if not, I would recommend that we take public comment and then allow the commission to continue deliberations. You can ask further questions that are outside of the scope of the presentation or the staff report, but I think that it would be important to do public comment at this time.
All right.
And let our consultants sit down, you mean?
Yes. Would you, yes, please have a seat, and we're going to, we do have a speaker slip. Cynthia Blatt wants to speak regarding this incentives for designated historic multifamily properties.
I did one before for all of you. I think that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We haven't even met before.
Thank you.
And while you're passing that out, Cynthia, I will say things that you already know, which is that we value public comment, but that pursuant to the Brown Act, we cannot take any action on items that are not listed on the posted agenda.
Oh,
And
this is
you
on
have
the
3
agenda,
minutes.
though.
Well, this is, yeah, but we can't take action. I don't know what she's addressing something in the
I'm
agenda.
not going to
but I'm
ask you to
just saying-
take action.
Okay,
Again.
all right, okay. And you have 3 minutes, thank you.
Okay, Cynthia Blatt, West Hollywood. I'll start for those who may not know or remember that I'm speaking as a private citizen, but I work for the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. I've worked there 15 years. I'm a grants administrator, public trust officer, and regulator. And I would like to start by saying that there are sources of money to take care of many of these programs in the city. On page 31 of the report by Page and Turnville, it states, state law prohibits direct grants to private property owners. There is a lot of confusion in the city about the difference between gifts of public funds and grants. Grants have a distinct and definite public benefit. And although it was stated earlier in the report that the benefit to a certain program wasn't sufficient to justify the cost of it, that implied that the only benefit is financial, and that is not the case. There are cultural benefits, and in the case of preservation, both in terms of rent stabilization and historic preservation, there's a public safety benefit, because as was pointed out at the Historic Commission the other day, many of the older buildings in the city, beautiful historic buildings that may be rent stabilized as well, have an aging infrastructure, and that's electrical and insulation that could catch fire. So not only, oh wait, I wanted to back up for a second. The reason that grants are not gifts of public funds, if you look at the regulations I just gave you, these are the HUD regulations governing the Community Development Block Grant Program. And as you can see from A1, privately owned buildings and improvements are eligible for rehabilitation. If you turn your pages over to historic preservation, you will also see that CDBG funds may be used for the rehabilitation, preservation, restoration of historic properties, whether publicly or privately owned. So this confusion, there probably is a state law that says you can't give gifts of public funds. There certainly is a federal law that says that, but grants are not gifts of public funds. Therefore, and I know I've talked to you guys about this before with respect to the Ellis Act, if we took the $286,000 that the city spends on sidewalk repair, the $400,000 that the city gives to people assisting the homeless, a worthy agency that provides services to greater Los Angeles County as opposed to West Hollywood, a couple of consultants' contracts for a couple of $100,000, and $2 or $3 million from the city's $100 million surplus, we would have $3.5 million to $4 million that could be put into a robust historic preservation program that would include rent-stabilized buildings. And as the Page and Turnbull reports noted that some percentage of these buildings have gone to market rate, that's where the feet of the Ellis Act comes in. Oh, all right. That's my 2-minute warning. All right. I have to say one quick thing. Commissioner Levin pointed out at Historic Preservation Commission the other day, and this is essential. SB 1818 was defeated by AB 2222 in September 2014. AB 2222 was implemented in January 2015, and SB 1818 is no longer valid or in existence as of December 31st, 2014, and the city knows this. So excuse me for being critical, but this was pointed out, and they do know it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we have more speakers. Let's see, I have Victor Omelchenko.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Victor Omolchenko, and I'm representing the West Hollywood Preservation Alliance that has reviewed the city staff report. And while the WHPA supports the 4 recommendations identified in the staff report, we believe that much more could be done to bolster the city's contention that it puts a high priority on historic preservation while ensuring its supply of affordable housing and support of rent-stabilized tenants. The WHPA strongly strongly supports the establishment of a historic apartment preservation program as outlined on page 30 of the Page and Turnbull Place Economics Report. You have the right to comment and consider that part. I hope and urge that the Rent Stabilization Commission makes a motion to include this program as a recommendation, which you're allowed to do. You're reviewing this report and making recommendations. And we would like to see the Rent Stabilization Commission take a public vote on this matter, as did the Historic Preservation Commission at its meeting this past Monday night, May 23rd. The potential costs of such a program could be better clarified in the report. Even so, the WHPA points out that the city made a record recent $7 million purchase of the 1 acre of vacant land at Crescent Heights and Santa Monica Boulevard, and a $2.5 million purchase of the former Coast Playhouse across from the city. When I look at page 4 of the staff report, to say that staff is not recommending this incentive due to a concern that there is not sufficient benefit to the city for this substantial investment, I'm really puzzled, and I wish we could all discuss why the city staff does not see this as a benefit. The city of West Hollywood has the financial resources. It's time it started to truly respect its historic buildings and the owners who provide 593 rent-stabilized units of housing for citizens of West Hollywood, and the city should allocate more money into maintaining our city's historic infrastructure. This is an example of stovepipes interconnecting rent stabilization, protecting tenants in their historic homes, and helping out owners. After a nearly 3-year process where $122,000 was spent on the contractor in myriad meetings. I know that Commissioner Gregor will probably have input because you did serve on the technical advisory group for this effort. The WHPA does support the 4 minor recommendations of the city staff, but we'd really like you to look and fully explore recommending that this historic preservation program, which is identified on page 30, is looked into, and it seems like a reasonable amount of money, up to $150,000 per year, which would be matched by owners, and it seems like a win-win. It does not seem like a substantial capital investment overlay to me, and it seems from the view graph that I saw earlier, it would be easy to implement with a matching program. So I know we're talking about changing the paint job and waiving $19,000 in annual fees. We're just talking about $19,000 per the report. I think there could be much more done to preserve both these historic buildings, which we've already identified as historic treasures and use and promote in our city literature, and showing how vibrant we are in terms of historic preservation, but at the same time, it seems like a win-win. We would be saving 593 stabilized units, which house about 1,000 rent-stabilized tenants, and as a rent-stabilized tenant, I hope that you, as our Rent Stabilization Commission, will look more closely into the program identified on page 30, and thank you for letting me extend beyond my time, Chair.
Thank you, Victor. Okay, and now we have Michael Voitkalevich.
I'll do it. No problem. Michael Voitkalevich, City of West Hollywood. Community Development Block Grant Program, Preserving America. Eligible CDBG activities which may support historic preservation and heritage tourism. Property rehabilitation. Rehabilitation constitutes a major area of opportunity for including historic preservation in programs designed to revitalize neighborhood and commercial areas, and for encouraging private sector involvement in community development and property rehabilitation activities. Eligible privately owned residential buildings and improvements limited to facades such as commercial buildings in a downtown area and code requirements of non-residential buildings are included, as well as energy systems improvements or retrofitting. So there was a question and somewhat of a debate that started at Historic Preservation on Monday. In looking into the HUD websites, it does seem as though private-owned residential buildings are eligible for CDBG, which is good because there seems to be a lot of money there. I'm not sure what it is currently, but I can tell you this from second and third quarterly reports, 2009, 2010, entered into City Council from the West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation, portfolio rehabilitation. As part of a long-term planning, we have identified rehabilitation needs in our operating portfolio. These needs have been prioritized into 3 categories: immediate, recommended, and suggested improvements. The city has been very generous to grant the corporation $605,822 in CDBG funding. The CDBG funds will provide new energy-efficient windows, boilers, and HVAC systems for 4 buildings. Now, here's the curious thing. In the next quarter, portfolio rehabilitation planning, over the next 3 years, with CDBG funds totaling $996,857, the corporation will make upgrades to the energy efficiency such as windows, HVAC, electrical, and boilers to, again, 4 properties that include 72 apartments. These rehabilitation will make significant improvement to the quality of life for not only low but moderate income households. So what's really odd about this is in different quarterly reports, we have a lot of money that's being allocated to what seems to be the 4 same projects through CDBG. So I urge this commission and every other commission who's looking at this to see where is our CDBG money actually going to.
Thank you, Michael. I believe that's all of the public comments that we have. Thank you very much, all of you. And so it's back to us for further questions and discussions. Commissioner Gregoire.
Just a question for staff. Just to clarify, what are you seeking from us today? Just our comments or a recommendation?
We're asking for comments that we can include as the project moves forward.
Okay, so you're not looking for a motion or
No,
a
we are
recommendation.
not.
You're just asking us to make comments that you can
Yes.
incorporate going forward. Okay,
Thank you.
great.
Are there further comments, Commissioner?
I just wanted to, I think this might be the appropriate time, as I am the liaison to the Historic Preservation Commission, which I attended, and it was well attended by the public and great conversations back and forth and comments. I just want to give you a brief summary of what happened there. Since these are completely intertwined, the buildings that are rent stabilized, and of course they are historic. So first of all, they did make a motion because they added many things that were in reference to the historic parts. They agreed with they supported the staff's 4 recommendations that we have in front of us on page 5 through 7. And as it was brought up by one of our speakers on page 4 of our staff report, the Historic Preservation Commission also recommended that they look into or implement the preservation easement. The city's staff's comment was recommending this incentive due to a concern that is not sufficient benefit to the city for this substantial investment. Although many speakers commented that they felt the benefit was to the community and to our preserving our rent-stabilized housing. So they included that as their 5th recommendation. And let's see, they requested that a full-time staff person be added for historic preservation. And they also would like, they had asked that someone look into the use of the CDBG CDBG grant money. There, as you know, there is a bit of controversy, as I believe our city attorney is the one who has stated that these funds can't be used, but apparently there's our other opinions about that, so they did ask the staff to look into that grant money. And let's see, was there anything else that they went over? They also agreed with the, and we're hoping that this commission would look at the repainting requirements and loosen those, because again, when it's an historic building, it can, layer after layer after layer, can remove some of its identifying features. And also, they liked the idea of cutting the registration fees in half. And I think that's about it. But it was interesting to me because they really took into consideration the fact that these, besides the fact that they are historic, they really looked at the intertwining of this. That was my report from Historic Preservation. My comment, particularly on this, on the bottom of page 4, in addition, such a program would need to be coordinated with a seismic study. I think, in my humble opinion, that if we don't do something about the seismic retrofitting of all of our buildings, but particularly the older ones, if we add just 1 point to the largest earthquake we've had recently, which was, 6.8, 6.9, depending on which time they took the survey, if we get to a 7.0, we won't have many buildings left if they have not been retrofitted. Right. I think somehow that, I mean, the older ones will go first, of course. Commissioner Levin also spoke about the importance of the wiring. You know, that again, we could lose a whole building like that if some of that 100-year-old wiring is not replaced. So he was hopeful that everything could be done. The accommodations could be made to these owners through rent stabilization to do whatever we can to, and whatever and some more incentives. So I think this just, kind of scratches the surface of what could be done. So I certainly agree with 4, and I would like to see 5 done, but that may not specifically come under rent stabilization. But again, I would like to see the seismic study, whatever we can do to help them so that we don't lose our housing to an earthquake, which of course could come at any moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you wish to speak?
I wanted to address the report from the WHPA about the building incentives. And I think most of you know that I am a landlord, but I am vehemently opposed to the city providing any funding whatsoever to private landlords. These properties that landlords own are our investments. For the city to give money to a property owner is akin to city resident John Doe. Your 401k account isn't doing that well this year. Let me boost your money up a little bit. Let me give you some money. These are investments, long-term investments. The only way I could think about stomaching any kind of financial involvement with the city would be if the buildings were to roll back their rents to pre-Costa Hawkins and freeze it for 20 years, and I don't think any property owner is going to agree to that. I also want to take offense over, the $400,000 that the city contracts with PATH. I will say that every single bed that the city contracts for a West Hollywood homeless resident is always filled. So that is not money that is being squandered. The money the city spent on the theater on Santa Monica Boulevard, That is an entirely different type of expenditure for the city, which will provide entertainment for thousands and thousands and thousands of people, bring in tax dollars, restaurants, the purchase of the property at Crescent Heights in Santa Monica. We all know there is no vacant land in the city. It was a really one of those rare opportunities for the city to acquire space for whatever the intended purpose might be. So I think that to compare preservation money for historic buildings and those types of expenditures, it's apples and oranges. Can't compare the two. But again, as a property owner who I would have loved to have had money to upgrade my property, I'm not sure if it's on the list or not. I have 2 units. But I'm just vehemently opposed to the city spending money on helping private landlords, private property owners do anything with their buildings. It feels incredibly inappropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Alexander, did you have a question or a comment?
Sure. So first, let me start off by saying thank you very much for the presentation. Very well done. I think it's very well thought out, and the fact that you have spent the time to independently contact each board, host community meetings, and take input from as many stakeholders as possible, I think is just a statement to your professionalism and the fact that you really did do the highest extent of due diligence possible in compiling the report. So I guess let me just list down through these 4 incentives that we have before us and give my input. So first off, the technical assistance to property owners and applicants, I think is fabulous. Providing anybody who's interested in doing business with the city with more resources, greater availability, and the ability to actually talk to a knowledgeable representative from the city who can help guide you through the process, who you may not necessarily be familiar with, is a great incentive. The fee waivers, I love it. I love the fact that we're trying to start a mutual relationship where both the landlords, the residents, and the city are all receiving a positive benefit. I think that as government agencies move forward, that's how we're going to see a lot of the new interactions, a lot of the public-private partnerships are created on the terms of everybody wins. So if we can come up with a way that everybody wins, everybody's happy. So I think that's a great incentive. The one thing that I would ask is that we do in some way, and I hate to use this word, but we do in some way obligate the landlords that do choose to take these incentives to actually using them for their intended purpose. So whether that's a change in verbiage or a change in mentality and how we put together the incentive, I think that's something we should definitely consider. In terms of the modifications based on the air rights, so I have a slight concern in terms of how that money is going to be used. So my fellow commissioners just noted that there's been issues with the possibility of an earthquake. But if we're just putting across a one-size-fits-all, you have to use them for maintenance, how did the landlord prioritize? What does the landlord choose to do maintenance on versus choosing to put that on the back burner? So given that, as my fellow commissioner just noted, these are investments, I feel that a lot of landlords, not all, but I think many, would be incentivized to keep up those parts of their properties that are most beneficial to their property values, which is fair. These are investments. That's what they should be doing. But for the public good and for the idea that we're trying to create a situation where everybody wins, perhaps we do create some sort of, or at least look into the creation of some sort of prioritization process. And as far as the alternatives to RSO painting, I mean, listen, the buildings have to look good. If paint's not what they need and they need another form of maintenance, by all means, whatever works to keep the landlords, the residents, and the community happy, friendly, and looking good, I think is a big part of why West Hollywood has become what West Hollywood is today. So I am all for basically all of the incentives as they are with the slight modifications that I've noted. On top of that, though, I would like us to consider the possibility of re-examining the low-cost loan program that was mentioned, but was detailed as possibly a future incentive that we can look at. The reason why I bring this up is because I think that's actually a great opportunity for the city to go into a much greater partnership with our landlords, to provide them resources that may not necessarily have available to them, but at the end of the day, the city is not giving away public goods. We're still going to receive a return on our investment, and everything that we've listed as goals is going to be accomplished, or at least we're providing landlords with the necessary resources to accomplish those goals. That's all that I have. Thank you. Oh, and if I also may make one last comment. John, if you can, please not leave. I'd love to find out where you got that bow tie. Awesome.
Anyone else? Any other comments? Questions?
I'll comment. Obviously, I participated in the technical advisory group, and it was an honor to do so. I was so impressed with all of the people involved in the process, from our city staff to our consultants to my fellow commissioners. I felt pretty inadequate on this technical advisory group because the other commissioners from Historic Preservation and the Planning Commission were so talented, and they had so much experience, personal experience, to offer the process. And I got the impression that the consultants and the staff really valued the comments of the Historic Preservation and the Planning Commissioners that participated. It was an incredible wealth of knowledge that came from these folks. So I was pretty impressed with them, and I was impressed with everybody involved in the process. I was also, I was so impressed with how the consultants wanted these buildings to be treated as the client. Like, the emphasis on this project was to protect these beautiful buildings that give West Hollywood their character. And some of these buildings are truly beautiful, and they're wonderful places to live. So it's wonderful that our city council and our community is looking for creative ways to preserve them. So that's all I really wanted to say. I support all the recommendations that were made to us this evening, and I hope the City Council adopts them. And obviously, I hope that we continue to explore all of the other options and any new options that come available in the coming years. It's possible things that weren't deemed feasible today may be deemed feasible tomorrow. So I think we need to obviously continue this discussion into the future, and every few years renew this effort to look for creative ways to preserve these historic properties. So that's all I have to say, and thank you to everybody involved in the process, and hopefully we get some good results out of this.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak? Josh? No?
Sure. I made the comment earlier that I appreciated the report. It was very well done. I take all that back. If you look at page 2 of the report, actually just past the title page, when it lists all the commission members,
Your name is, yes.
I don't see my name anywhere.
Subtle hint.
But if I were to set that aside,
just so you know, Josh, a community member went on to the city's website and your name was missing, and I believe he made sure it was corrected.
well, I think
You might want to check that, though.
whoever that was. So again, great job on the report. I have to echo what Commissioner Gregoire said, because I wasn't an official member of any of the task forces or the focus groups, but about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, I stumbled in. I thought I was supposed to be at this meeting. I stumbled into this meeting in a small room at Plummer Park, people I recognized, and I sat down, and then we started the meeting, and they started talking about all this stuff, and I realized instantly I had no idea what they were talking about. They were so specific and technical, I guess it's a technical group. I realized that, wow, I was in the wrong group, and luckily there were familiar faces, and so about a year and a half, but I found it fascinating, the parts that I could understand, and a year and a half later, I get an email inviting me back to this meeting, and I had to say, well, I was invited I don't know how I got invited to the first one, or if I just stumbled in on it, but I don't think it's appropriate for me to come back, because I didn't really do much in the first meeting. Then Stephanie said, oh, come on, you can come back. So I did find it interesting. I went back, and it made a lot more sense to me then. They had hashed out a lot of things, and they were talking about a lot of these proposals, both the ones that were proposed or are being proposed, and also some of them that are not being proposed but are in the report. And Since then, that was several months ago, this report, really focused in on what those questions that came up in that last meeting that I attended were really hashed out and went into, the answers were looked up and researched and were explained in the report. So I really appreciate that. I mean, it just shows one example of how well staff and the consultants have done in preparing this report. They really did take these comments into play and researched them and brought back answers. In terms of one of the things I'd just like to say about this overall thing is, this is one of the issues that we all agree on. We all understand the importance of the historic preservation. We all understand and want to preserve our rent-stabilized units and really any housing for that matter at this point. But this is something that we can all come together on. And how we do that, obviously, is, do we take money from here? Do we use money from this over here? Those are all questions that we don't have to address. The City Council will have to. But I support everything that's been brought up tonight in terms of if it gets us to the goals that we're trying to achieve of preservation of the rent-stabilized units, and then also the historical preservation of the buildings, structural and safety, all those. There's, in discussion, the CDBG funds, I think we should use whatever dollars we can for this project, any new dollars. I'm not in a position to say, we should take money from sidewalks to go to this or anything like that. I'm just saying that if we were to bring in more money or the City Council decided to reprioritize things, I am open to using any monies that we can possibly find and use for this project or for these projects and rent stables and any incentives we can do for other areas of housing and rent stabilization. But like I said, I'm not in a position tonight to sit and prioritize which things are more important over the other, and that's not what we're being asked to do. In terms of the RSO, or specifically about the alternatives to the RSO painting requirements, whether it be painting or anything in the RSO, I don't want the RSO to ever be something that is the holdback or prohibits us from making safety improvements or preserving the historic or the historic buildings, anything like that. So I'm open to whatever language that staff or the City Council comes up with later on that will still, my only concern is whatever the end result is, please, to help us and the hearing examiners in their hearings, please still try to make it to where it's very black and white now. Whether you are in compliance with the code or you're not. And so be restrained in that area. But other than that, it doesn't matter to me if it's 4 years or 8 years or 12 years, whatever that it comes out to be. But black and white is the most highest priority to me. In terms of low interest loans, I think that is a very good idea. I think it's a very good example of how we can another idea of funding sources that don't actually cost the city much money or anything at all. Even if they were no interest loans, the city still has, they can secure those loans, and I think that would be an excellent idea to look into as an option for funding for these. I am not against finding new sources in terms of the city using current funds in our city budget and giving them away, whether it be through grants or kind of what you had spoke about, just giving money to property owners to preserve it. I don't have the concern of the public gift. I think there's lots of ways around that. But in terms of using that as our first initial phase, I'm not excited about that part. Let's try some of these other things first, and then we'll look at, in maybe an annual budget, the City Council can look at what our priorities are, and if preserving buildings are more important than the sidewalk repaired that year, that's fine. We can transfer money that way, but that's not where I want to initially go to. I want to try some things out first, or I would recommend the council try some things out first before dipping into the city budget. And I think that about covers everything. I really appreciate Commissioner Harker's report on her attendance at the Preservation or Historic Preservation Commission. That's was very helpful to me tonight, added to the report, and it was a perspective that was hinted at, or some people spoke about tonight, but yours was very all-encompassing, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Could I add just one thing to that, that the Preservation suggested, Historic Preservation Commission, and that was that the permit fees for, redoing the electrical and the plumbing, that those be waived as well for landlords. Again, it's a pittance of money for those, but it might help the landlords. And also that at some point, this type of incentive would be extended to all 80 of our historic buildings, even those that are not multifamily dwellings. That, we really start to do that, and that these buildings represent half, our rent-stabilized units represent half of our entire historic catalog right now. And that Mr. Abramson spoke in comment, Rick Abramson, mentioned that, people actually come to West Hollywood to see some of these buildings, that's one of the benefits, and that without our historic preservation program, and again, including our rent-stabilized units, without that program, we are ineligible for to be a member of the League of California Cities, which of course we prize, and that's one of the important components of it. So again, I think that doing everything we can, including the permit fees being waived, will help keep the character of our city. Thank you.
Can I add one more thing, Chair? Sorry, it was the thing that I came here tonight to say, and I forgot all about it. It's new, it's new.
There will be a time limit placed on this one.
The one thing that I did have in mind, that I've had in mind for quite some time now, is about the air rights. And I've talked to Ms. Reich about this, and I'm fairly comfortable with it now after speaking with her more thoroughly. But I would like to say this on the record so that maybe and I'll let the council know as well, but I like the idea of the air rights transfer, and I totally support it. I'm just not sure if this is where, in this limited scale, we want to use it to test it out. And I kind of think of the state's cap and trade program. I know, we're not giving up anything bad here to create some good. We're just transferring air rights. But my concern is that if we jump into this and using these air rights, which I think is a great tool, it has a lot of potential, I don't want to limit ourselves or the city's ability to possibly expand such a program without affecting the program in existence. So I know that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I'll elaborate more when I talk to the council, but that's my only concern about the air rights, is that I don't want to jump into any new idea like that that we could use we could potentially use as a tool for a lot of other things, but it's not something we can necessarily do over and over and over again.
Okay, thank you. I think that we've concluded our comments. Good. All right. I want to thank you all for all the work that was put in. I want to thank the members of our community who have so passionately come to speak to us and have put in a great deal of thought and research. And the fact that we don't take the actions that you request doesn't mean that we don't appreciate your input and haven't taken the information in, although I think all of you know way more than I do about most of these things. I didn't even know, I don't have no idea what CDBG is. So you know a lot more than I do, but keep educating me. Thank you all. Thank you, staff. Everybody should be good and tired by now, and so we will bring this meeting to a close, and we will...
We do have one more item,
We have
an
one
item
more
of
item?
unfinished business. This is, it's a
Oh.
resolution that the commission reviewed. You had revisions to, this was for a case heard on April 14th. And I believe at the last meeting, the commission did have a question about whether you needed to take a vote on it or not. We had originally thought that that night, the vote was sufficient. However, our council has recommended that the commission go ahead and make a vote on that item, and so that's before you at this point.
And
I'll volunteer to go ahead and make that motion if you'd like. On page 75 of our packet, we have a draft resolution that reflects the decision we made at the last meeting. Therefore, I'll make a motion to adopt Resolution RSC 16-485, which is a resolution of the Rent Stabilization Commission of the City of West Hollywood, affirming in part, modifying in part, and reversing in part the hearing examiner's decision on application D-4078 involving 950 Larrabee Street.
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Do we need to take a roll call vote on this?
Yes.
Roll call vote, please.
Commissioner Bergstein?
Aye.
Commissioner Kerpes? Commissioner Kerpes?
Aye.
I'm sorry. Commissioner Gerfinkel?
Aye.
Commissioner Gregoire?
Aye.
Commissioner Harker?
Aye.
Excuse me, Vice Chair Maggio?
Aye.
Chair Sains?
Aye. All right, then now. So we have no further staff comments?
We do have public comment.
I don't have any more.
I know,
slips.
I haven't had a chance to get up there, but
You have
we
more?
do have Victor Omanchenko,
Oh,
followed
okay.
by Cynthia Blatt.
Okay.
Good evening again, Commissioners. Victor Omolchenko, longtime West Hollywood resident and a rent-stabilized tenant. And listen, I'm going to do this to myself. Yesterday at the Senior Advisory Board, longtime residents Marcy Norton, the daughter of our former county librarian Rita Norton, Marcy Norton and I got the Senior Year Awards yesterday. So it was a really nice... Really nice affair. Commissioner Harker was there, other commissioners were there, Mayor Meister was there, Councilmember Horvath was there. So it was a really nice event. And even though I'm now outed as a senior, I plan to be around. And what I just wanted to share with you is that I am very concerned. Some new studies have come out, and I just wanted to share with you, just to put on, to share, is that the most recent residential rental list for the city dated today shows that the median price, the median asking rate for a one-bedroom apartment has now gone up to $2,000 in our fair and lovely city, and the median rent for a two-bedroom apartment has gone up now to $2,500. So that means over a period of a year, if you use 30% of a person's income, a person to afford a one-bedroom apartment would have to make $80,000 a year, and to afford a two-bedroom apartment, it would be $100,000 a year. Another study from a group called Smart Assets shows that Los Angeles as a whole was the biggest percentage increase in rent over the last year of 17.1%, and they estimate that the cost that you would have to have $145,000 to rent a two-bedroom apartment. So whatever you folks can do as our rent stabilization commissioners, what we can do as a community to somehow look into what we're going to do about, the whole, housing situation, the rent stabilization situation. We, in the community, we've heard for years and years from developers that, oh, if you just let us build it taller, bigger, more denser, the more supply you have, the prices will come down. I think that's a myth that needs to be debunked. I do not see the prices coming down even as our city approves higher, denser, more development. And this, and I did hear earlier, there is this law, and I know SB 1818, we keep hearing about it, but it has been somewhat supplanted by a new law, Assembly Bill 2222, and at some point, I hope that the city will look at implementing policy and regulations that reflect the changes that have been wrought to SB 1818 by this new AB 2222. That law was passed in late 2014, so we need to look at that also. Thank you, and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Congratulations again.
Thanks.
Hi, Cynthia Blatt again. So I just kind of gently want to correct some misconceptions about grants. Grants are not a check written to somebody, here, do something with it to make your building better. It's not going into anyone's account anyplace. A grant is, basically it's a three-step process. A funding organization, whether it's state, federal, local, or a foundation, issues a notice of funding availability that says we have this money and here's what we want to do with it. And then the applicant will put in an application that says, if you give me this money, here's what I will do with it. Here's my budgets, here's my plan, here's what I seek to accomplish. And then the third process is, here's how I did. Here's my performance plan. Here's my performance report. Here's what happened. Throughout the process, the grant-giving organization oversees the implementation of that grant. That's part of the job that I do. So to alleviate your anxiety about giving grants to the owners of private buildings, they can't do whatever they want with it. They have to say, this is what we will do with it, and it will meet the need that was put forth by the funding agency when they said, here's what we want you to do with it. I also wanted to just address for a moment Commissioner Kirby's. There are grants from organizations like FEMA for earthquake retrofitting. Different divisions of HUD have a lead-based paint abatement program grants from our Healthy Homes lead-based abatement program. There are grants from Interior and Commerce and Small Business Administration, and many of these grants can match each other. So when you have someone who actually knows how grants work, what grants can match each other, what grants can't, and there is usually a matching requirement. So if the owner of a private building, and as you can see from the regulations that I handed out, if the owner of a private building gets a grant, it is likely that he or she will have to add something as match, whether it's cash match or in-kind match. And usually match is on the order of 20 to 25%. So I just want to be clear. And CDBG stands for Community Development Block Grant Money. It's federal money block granted to the states and localities based on a demographic formula that has to do with population, all kinds of different economic formulas. So the city of West Hollywood receives its community development block grant allocation from the county of Los Angeles, who receives it from the state, who receives it from us. So, from the agency for which I work, but that I'm not speaking for tonight. So I just really want to try to clarify that, because it's disturbing to me, this misconception about gifts of public funds, because we don't allow that either, and grants. Then I wanted to just quickly, before my time runs out, SB 1818 was an amendment to the state density bonus law that was defeated because 3 days ago, Curb LA reported the loss of 125,000 units of rent-stabilized housing in the city of Los Angeles. And AB 2222, which requires a one-to-one replacement of rent-stabilized housing that is destroyed by previous laws, a one-to-one replacement in order to try to bring back some of this loss of affordable housing that was part of the unintended consequence of SB 1818. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for that explanation of CDBG? Yeah, thanks. CDBG. I'm really getting tired. Okay. All right. Then if there are no staff comments, there are some staff
we have comments.
Commission comments. You guys are going to kill me. We have commission comments yet again. It seems like all we've done is comment all evening. Okay.
I just wanted to,
I
first of
knew it
all,
would be.
I'm sorry, Victor, for not notice or for not bringing it up earlier, but congratulations. I actually proofread the certificate from our office that you received yesterday, so. And I also wanted to, speaking of seniors, wanted to bring up on June 24th, our office, along with Jewish Family Services and West Hollywood Comprehensive Service Center, will be hosting a senior scam stopper seminar on Friday, June 24th at Plummer Park from 10 to noon. It'll be followed by lunch. But this is a really we've done it several times throughout our district. Basically, it's we bring in experts from the state. They talk about different frauds. They provide fraud information relating to home repair and other frauds that are going on at the time, because they're constantly coming up with new scams over the phone and through the mail and even at your door. So I encourage everyone to go to that. I have a flyer here if anyone would like, but you'll be getting emails hopefully from our office in the next couple days, and that's about it. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments?
Just my usual announcements. Well, first of all, I will want to remind my fellow commissioners I will be missing in action on June 9th, our meeting. Sorry to miss that, but I'll be collecting shells on Moonstone Beach, and it was a better offer. But I wish you all well for that meeting. And since I will not be there to announce our rent stabilization organization building blocks meetings, which you know I highly tout. Our fabulous staff gives excellent seminars. The one on June 14th is Save Money and Avoid Fines, Code Compliance. And where that sounds like it's only for the landlords, I think it's a good thing for the tenants to have a complete understanding of. They cover minimum maintenance standards for habitability, security and safety, and the requirements for noticing prior to entering apartments, which the tenants, of course, would like to be well informed about, and when to relocate tenants during repairs. So that's also at Plummer Park at 7 o'clock in rooms 5 and 6. And then on June 28th, making the connection with social service providers. Learn what services are available to assist qualified senior and low-income West Hollywood residents. This course will provide information for tenants, family members, caregivers, and landlords. And again, if you need those meetings to be translated, they will have someone there who speaks Russian if you make sure to contact, or any other language, I'm sure, to contact the Rent Stabilization Department at City Hall. And again, that is at 7 o'clock in Plummer Park at the Community Center, rooms 5 and 6. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other comments? No? Staff comments?
No comments.
Okay. Then, at last. The next meeting of the Rent Stabilization Commission will be held on June 9th without Stephanie in West Hollywood Park Public Meeting Room, Council Chambers. This meeting is adjourned.